Hi, and welcome to the Power of Connection and Biz Show. I'm Kimberly Layne, executive leadership coach, team building partner, best-selling author, and your host. Today's guest is a dynamic go-getter, having built 6 of his own companies from the ground up. 2 are still active, while 4 have been successfully scaled and sold. These companies cover a broad spectrum from car leasing, systems integration consulting, business process outsourcing, and software distribution. His previous firm was sold to the global auditing giant KPMG. Not only is he a go-getter, but he knows how to achieve great returns for his investors. He raised, on average, a return of 11 times invested capital for 2 of his sold companies that were funded through outside capital. To date, he has personally advised hundreds of C-level executives, entrepreneurs, and business owners across 26 unique industries. He has mentored, advised, and challenged them to grow their firms, enhance their business operations, and improve their financial performance, leaving a trail of accolades for his advisorship. And today he's going to share how he does it. Please welcome our guest, who also happens to be a college buddy too, from the great Kent State University in the beautiful Midwest Ohio. Please welcome our guest, who is also CEO of Ask My Board, Pete Martin. Pete, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show today. Thanks for joining us.
Wow, it's such a great intro. Thanks, Kimberly. I appreciate it. And go Flashes, of course.
Yes, for sure. And then I know Cleveland just recently changed the Indians to the
Cleveland Guardians.
Oh my gosh. How do you feel about that?
I'm super excited. I think that was my favorite name that they picked. And there's these Guardian statues kind of on the Carnegie Bridge near the stadium that can kind of overlook everybody. And it's a cool name. I think it means a lot. So super excited about it. And this is kind of the whole thing is this is kind of the beginning of a new era for the new old Cleveland Indians, new Cleveland Guardians. So
yeah, and I think for Cleveland in general, I think it's a good move. I think it'll be interesting to see how much more positive it gets, right?
Yep, for sure.
Great. So we're going to just jump in right into the whole connection talk, if you're okay with that.
Absolutely.
So I know this is your 6th business, and most of your previous businesses have had a national or a global workforce, if you will. So how did you foster that engagement and a connection across the teams and across a global workforce?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll go back to the consulting business. When we started it in Cleveland in 2003, we made a strategic decision to not constrain ourselves to the labor pool in Cleveland. So, and this was kind of unique for my co-founder and me, that, we were both used to having big offices with lots of people in it. And that was kind of the ego things, what size office did you have? And so we made a very difficult but strategic decision. So we had to figure out how to build connection into the framework and the fabric of the company from the very beginning. And so if you fast forward after we founded the company 2 years, I think 90% of our employee base was all over the country. And I'm talking from Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, down in Orange County, Cleveland, New York, Florida, like they were everywhere. And what was very unique, not only about just having this disparate and diverse workforce, but because they were consultants and they were typically in our customers' locations, they actually became more connected to the clients than they did to the company because they were with them every day. Right? So this whole notion of connection and how do you do that from a leadership perspective really was a big challenge for us from the very beginning. And I'll kind of skip to the end and then go back. But so when you think about what happened with COVID over those last 18 months and the pandemic, a lot of companies who were not used to doing this culturally really struggled, right? And I think they're struggling now. And for my 2 current businesses, this was just not a big deal because we literally kind of already had that decade of experience of how you do that. And we can talk about, some very specific tactics and strategies that we put in place. Well, the one was, when we started the company, we created this thing called a manifesto, our company manifesto. Okay. And we literally wrote in detail what kind of clients we wanted to have, what kind of employees we wanted to hire. We literally kind of captured on a piece of paper what our dream employee would look like. And never once did we say they had to be in our headquarters location, right? We just kind of built this profile. And then we put through this manifesto specifically how we were going to retain the loyalty of the employees. And so everything we did, so if you had a Friday night happy hour, right, where you've got an on-premise location, we were doing that virtually 13 years ago.
Wow.
We would do things like with employee recognition. I'll give you a perfect example. We had just a stellar top performing employee that we wanted to recognize. We had kind of a quarterly employee of the quarter award. And, in a traditional office setting, to keep that connection, you'd have everybody kind of get together in a room and you celebrate this, right? We took most of the management team. This person happened to be out in San Francisco. We took most of the management team and we flew them out there and went to the client site where this person was located. And we did it right there on the client site. And so there was lots of things that we would just do very, very differently than I think any other company that was kind of back 13 years ago, that we could replicate the same kinds of things you do to keep that connection in a on-premise location. And we just did it remotely. So just took some kind of different thinking and to just maintain that connection and make sure that was fundamentally part of the company.
So help me understand when you had your executives fly to San Francisco and to acknowledge and recognize that individual at the customer site, by the way, which I think is stellar, did the rest of the company see that from a virtual perspective, or how was that just communicated, or not necessarily? It was just that the executive team was flying out there specifically, obviously, to be in person with that exceptional employee, right? So just trying to understand the visibility.
Yeah, it's kind of embarrassing to say this. It was long enough ago that you didn't really have kind of live conferencing,
right?
Zoom and that kind of stuff back then. So we filmed the whole thing, and then we played it back kind of afterwards as kind of continued recognition. But no, you didn't really have that. It used to be the web conferencing. You'd have to buy $10,000 worth of equipment and had to be in both sites, and kind of crazy. But yeah.
No, but I love the fact that it sounds like you're really cognizant about the experience and valuing employees. And, I think people are realizing more today the need to acknowledge and recognize, and it's not this hierarchical leadership anymore that maybe existed, back in that particular time period you're talking about. So you're really ahead of the game as far as public recognition, just recognize employees on a regular basis, which I think it totally changes the whole culture and atmosphere. I also like the fact that you did it on the client campus, if you will. I remember I got a promotion that I was challenged in trying to get from an assistant vice president to vice president, and they actually did something similar where they flew out to the customer site where I was and announced my vice presidency in front of the entire client. So that was great, especially from a clients embrace that employee already and is their liaison. And then to be part of that whole celebration is probably huge from not only the client's perspective, the employee's perspective, and then your company's perspective. So very cool.
For sure. Yeah, and I'll tell you, kind of, if you think at a macro level with what's going on right now in business, capital is really cheap, and there's literally $1 trillion worth of capital globally for companies to tap into. Then you've got your ability to create a business, scale a business, just in terms of the cost of everything that's gone down. It's easier than ever to do this. So then, so if capital is abundant and resources to grow and scale is abundant, what's left? It's people, right? And we all know what's going on right now. The war for talent is on again, and probably tougher than it's ever been. And if you think about the pool of valued employees that we want, they tend to be millennials or whatever,
right?
And they've got a different cultural mindset towards working, and it's not the money. They don't want money thrown at them, right? And the companies that are going to win have great cultures, and a fundamental part of that culture is this notion of connection. And they can pick up and leave and go anywhere they want tomorrow, and they will, right? And the level of loyalty is pretty low right now relative to the last 20, 30 years. And so if executives and leaders don't get this and they don't adapt the culture to put connection to the center of everything they do, and making sure their employees feel valued and appreciated and they're growing and they're learning, yeah, then they're going to lose them and they're going to lose in the end.
Yeah, I like you touched on this, and I'm doing some research on this because I think it's an interesting dichotomy. You have, maybe a decade ago where that whole connection and what I call human-centered leadership and the focus on the human experience and employee validation, having the employee have something that they feel like they belong to a community at work. There's a higher purpose from a organization perspective, a higher purpose as far as a charity is concerned, or well-being, or, giving back kind of a thing, not necessarily as strong as a focus, back in the day. And millennials today are using what I feel, and, studies are showing that social media and not being in person is actually a disconnect. And so in contrast, they're demanding from their work environment the very connection that they're missing, say in their personal life, right? Because they're so much on social media, because, during the pandemic, they were disconnected, because they're not, the way they interact with other people is so much on digital technology, which is absent of emotion, which is really how we connect. And now they're asking their employer and work environment to have that emotional connection. And I just think that's kind of an interesting dichotomy. And as a leader, you mentioned, if you're not creating that validation, trusting environment, sense of community, sense of higher purpose, you're not going to be able to retain your employees. And you hit on the nail on the head when everything else is kind of an equal player. When a company's trying to grow or a company's trying to complete, it's really your talent is how you can differentiate yourself and really, be more profitable or win the clients, if you will, versus just the technology, right?
Yeah, and there was a today in July 23rd, 2021, there's a McKinsey article that came out talking about kind of post-COVID, do you force employees to come back to the office?
Right.
Do you have a hybrid work environment, right? And I think we're seeing companies take kind of one of three stances. Some are saying you can't duplicate that feeling of community remotely, so we're going to force you to come back in the office. Some are taking this hybrid approach, and some are taking a completely laissez-faire, just saying, we'll figure it out. Just, you can stay remote for a while. And the McKinsey study was basically saying, nobody knows what's going to happen like 1 or 2 years from now, that and that it will probably come down fundamentally to the unique culture of each company. And if I go back to the fact that, we had always had remote employees and had to create that community with a bunch of remote people, we kind of got it. We already had processes and systems and everything in place to kind of handle that. And the companies that don't, right, that always had physical offices, they're really going to struggle because it's a very, very different mindset. And particularly if you have an older, I don't know what older means, but an older, more just kind of traditional leadership team in place that is used to, I'm the first one in the office and I'm the last one to leave. And I want to make sure that all my meetings are kind of, spending as much time in the office as I am, man, they're going to struggle. Because that's not what it's about, right? It's about outcomes, period. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. And, I think you're square at the center of this thought leadership around how do you create community and how do you create connection when you may not see people all the time, and how do you, and then ones that are doing this hybrid thing, they're trying to replace human connectivity with digital, with Slack and whatever, right? And it's not the same thing. And so I think this is going to be studied for a long, long time.
Yeah. It's definitely, I think if you ask really anybody, that as much as it's been a blessing, especially during the pandemic, to be able to have access to virtual platforms, like Zoom, if you will, and it certainly has helped us get through that pandemic. However, I think anybody would agree, if they have an opportunity to meet somebody in person, to have lunch or happy hour, versus doing it over Zoom, or to meet somebody in person, when time permits and it's not a big travel thing, hands down, people will just say, I've missed that in-person experience, right? I mean, I had my first in-person meeting with a client yesterday, and I was just, oh my gosh, I feel like it's been 18 months since I've been able to drive in a car and get to the client and have one-on-one meetings with them, and then have some debrief afterwards. And you're not just hanging up after the Zoom call, and you really have no way to really debrief about what just transpired any follow-up necessarily. It just is a lot more awkward, but you just miss that human element of the energy exchange and the connection. So
Yeah,
totally
sure.
spot on. I'm going to switch gears a second here, because I know in having our past conversations, you've mentioned that, from a comparison, Netflix has had a culture of brutal transparency with its employees. So I'm kind of curious, because I really speak to organizations and to leaders and coach them on really trying to be vulnerable, trying to have transparent communication. If we don't have the answers as employees or even as leaders, what do? We make up the worst case scenario. And that tends to can be very anti-productive and create a mistrusting culture and really prevent the community we're talking about. So I'm curious about, what is your view on transparency with employees? Do you think it helps or hinders the connection between leaders and their teams?
Yeah, I'm going to address this indirectly for a second, then I'll come back and kind of try to address it directly. So part of our coaching practice, we talk about just performance management, right? And how as leaders and how as a CEO or business owner of a company, how do you make sure you're getting the best out of people every day? And we take a lot of cues out of a book that was written about 10 years ago. And this guy did extensive research, hundreds of thousands of employees to figure out, and looking at high performing organizations versus low performing organizations, and figured out kind of what was the difference from a management perspective, right? What were they doing differently? And what came out of the book was very interesting. Some of it's kind of common sense, but things like having an employee of the month club is a really bad idea. Because for two reasons. One is, a lot of times it's always the same person getting it. And yes, that person may feel great, but everybody else feels like crap, right? And then it almost builds this sense of resentment, right? Right. Susie's going to get it again, right? She got it again. And it was interesting because we had this in my old company, and we did it kind of monthly, and then we kind of moved it to quarterly. And we did kind of see that a little bit, that you saw this demotivation of the people that didn't get it.
Right.
And there's a whole bunch of practices in there that I think people have been used to for the last couple of decades, that this researcher was able to, kind of surface and say, these are really fundamentally bad management practices. And one of them was around performance reviews, right? And the old style performance review was once a year, put your goals in place. I'm going to look at the OKRs and the KPIs and the blah, blah, blah. And once a year, I'm going to see how you're doing. Again, bad practice. After a year's over, if somebody's screwed up, they don't have time to fix a screw up, right? And so it's that combination of the transparency, being very open and honest with somebody's performance, but catching it on the spot, not even waiting for the quarterly thing, right? And if you're doing it regularly, both good behavior and bad behavior, people can't adjust. And I worked for two very large Fortune 100 companies, and we would always have this performance improvement plan, right? The PIP plan of somebody that wasn't making their numbers. And I happened to be in sales for most of my career. And we'd put a sales rep on a 90-day performance plan, right? And it was the stupidest thing in the world, because it's like, if you missed your $10 million quota, you're not going to make it up in 90 days, right? It was stupid. And so I personally kind of moved away from that. I stopped doing interviews, and it was just much more this monthly, what are you doing really well that I know I can kind of project out and see that you're going to be a performer or you're not, and try to hit it on the spot. So I think it's this combination of not only the transparent communication, but it's the frequent communication and catching those great behaviors, saying, that's exactly what I'm looking for. Thank you. That's phenomenal. And on the flip side, hey, that's not really what we're looking for here, right? And this is exactly why, and this is the kind of behavior we expect.
No, you kind of made me think, and very often when I'm coaching leaders, I think, especially new leaders, they actually want to avoid being a leader, because what got them there, all the doing and all their expertise, isn't really what's going to keep them as a leader. And they're not comfortable with some of the transparent conversations, difficult conversations, or, giving constructive feedback necessarily. And, leadership is not just that one day a year on that performance review or that quarterly performance review. It's leadership as a role as a leader is to build a relationship with your people that it's safe enough for them either to come to you for guidance. I don't get it. I need some help. I'm struggling. Or for you to have open conversations to motivate them to be at their best and to perform at their best. It's kind of like you mentioned, 90 days later, if they've been not doing the right thing for 90 days, it's hard for them to adjust, especially when their PIP plan is pretty much near to the end, right? So I always didn't understand why, if you have a yearly quota of $10 million, why you have to make it up in 90 days, just kind of heroic effort.
Yeah.
The Hail Mary pass, right?
Right, exactly.
Like football player, right? So anyway, so some interesting thoughts. So I want to give you an opportunity because we really haven't talked about it. And I love your whole idea about Ask My Board. Before we close out the show, would you share with us a little bit about what Ask My Board's about? And then we'll talk a little bit about our promotion for our listeners today.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ask My Board is essentially an outgrowth of stuff that I've been doing for decades. And my personal mission statement, which I created when I was 16 years old, believe it or not, was to help people realize the potential they have within themselves. And so I found that I was always doing that. And I was mentoring a lot of other entrepreneurs. And since I've started, sold 4 companies, started 2 other ones, I had a lot of wisdom to give to entrepreneurs and to business leaders. And through my IBM and SAP career, again, I've counseled tons and tons of executives. And so about 18 months ago, a friend of mine said, Pete, you spend a lot of time with these guys. You've never asked for any money. Like, why don't you create a business out of this? And, I was kind of mixed on it because I do it because I like to do it. I wasn't doing it for the money. And I enjoy just watching people develop into something bigger than they thought they could be. And so about 18 months ago, we started putting tons of content together about how do you truly grow a company, not fluff, not the, the strategy of du jour, but there are strategic frameworks that are used by the world's fastest growing companies. So we captured those all in across every dimension of the business. So from people to capital to growth strategies to customer acquisition to across the board, and strategic execution and systems and processes put in place. And we created this framework out of all this, and that's really what became of Ask My Board. When we focus on companies that want to grow faster, and we focus on companies and business owners that specifically have an exit plan in place. So my first 2 exits, I left millions of dollars on the table, literally, just because I had no idea what I was doing.
Interesting.
And so by the time that I sold my last business to KPMG that you referenced, I sold it for 12 times EBITDA with no earnout. And both of those are pretty unheard of in that services business. And it's not because I was super smart or got lucky. It's because I screwed it up 3 times before that. And so that's a big part.
Mistakes, right?
Yeah, right. And so, and if you're a business owner who wants to sell their company, you're lucky if you get to do this once, maybe twice. And the world that you then operate in, the folks that are the company that's going to acquire you, to if you're being advised by an M&A firm, whatever, they do this for a living, right? So our role really is to help protect the business owner and the CEO, both in terms of helping to grow their business because they're getting advice from lots of different people that typically is wrong and inaccurate. And then particularly from an exit perspective is to really help them, be their coach, guide, and advisor to make sure that they get this right because they're going to get one shot at it, period. So that's my point.
No, I think it's a phenomenal idea and a phenomenal gift to people out there who are starting their own business and or wanting to exit the business and want to make sure they're doing it right. They have the right exit strategy and they're not leaving money on the table like you already referred to. I think that's just such a gift to be able to, that you're giving to these people to be able to really do it right. Like this might be their only time. And so to really capitalize on that, I think that's just a very good concept. So for our listeners, if you want to take advantage and learn a little bit more about Ask My Board, we'll have information about Pete and his company in the show notes. Then you also can reach out and get a 25% discount on a business value assessment as a guest of the show. Simply mention in the email that you're listening in on the podcast today on the Power of Connection and Biz Show. Thank you to all our listeners for supporting our content here. If you liked our content, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and post a review. And I especially want to thank my friend and dear guest, Pete Martin, CEO of Ask My Board. And thank you so much for the time today, Pete.
Thanks, Kimberly. I appreciate it. And I hope that your listeners get a little bit something out of the conversation. And I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. Me too. So, and we'll close with, remember, connections change everything.